Good evening or morning or whatever time of the day it happens to be. Welcome one, welcome all to the Writer's Block podcast. I'm your host, Greg Nikes, and this week I'm sitting down with children's and young adult author Jasmine Warga to talk about her latest book, The Unlikely Tale of Chase and Finnegan. We'll dive into Jasmine's approach for conveying big emotional themes to her young readers, discuss the real-world program that led to this unlikely animal friendship, the importance of interacting directly with her young readers, and so much more. If you guys are enjoying the Writer's Block podcast, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your podcasting platform of choice. Follow along with us on social media. We are at Writer's Block Pod on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you want to go the extra mile and help support the show directly, you can head over to our Patreon. That is patreon.com/writersblockpod, where you can get episodes of the show one day early and help us keep the lights on. All right, without further nonsense from me, let's dive into our conversation today with Jasmine Warga. So, Jasmine, you are a Cincinnati native. Your new middle grade novel, The Unlikely Tale of Chase and Finnegan, was even inspired by real-life animal ambassador programs like the cheetah program at the Cincinnati Zoo. Before we get started, before we dive into the weeds too much, as a Cincinnati native, I just want to get your opinion on this. Maybe you don't have one, that'd be fine too. Which side of the issue do you fall on? Are you a Skyline person or are you a Gold Star person?
The only answer to this question is that I'm a Skyline person. I think
Ah,
there's very few actual Cincinnati natives that would pick Gold Star. So, of course, I'm a Skyline girl.
that's fair. I was a brief transplant for a period of time for work, and I became a Gold Star fan, but that was when they were doing their like revamped burgers, so that was kind of I got very excited about that.
Yeah, that's how my husband is too. Like, he likes a lot of like the other menus on Gold Star, and I don't understand. I don't think I've ever been to a Gold Star in my entire life. So,
You are a writer who feels very comfortable in the YA and middle grade space. You seem to have a vested interest in connecting with young readers through themes of identity and mental health and connection in very real ways. When you got started, were these the kinds of stories that you wanted to tell, and what impact did you hope to make with them?
yeah, so I wanted to be a writer, but when I was in high school and college, I had a very like thin idea of what a writer was. I just thought I was going to publish like short stories that would be in the Paris Review or something like that, but I could never really figure out what those stories were, right? I didn't feel like this burning inside me that I had something to say and wanted to say it. And then my first job when I graduated from college was teaching sixth grade. And that's when I had this light bulb moment of remembering the reader that I was at that age. And being a kid was really hard for me. I was a lonely kid. I was a strange kid. I didn't feel like I fit in, especially in my small town that was a little bit outside of Cincinnati. But books helped me to understand that my world at that moment was small, but that the world itself isn't small. And I realized like this was what I wanted to do. I felt like I had a lot left to say about being a kid. And I love how so much of Kidlit, I think, works with the reader, right? The writer sort of sets the score, but the reader is making the music. And I love that. I love that it's an invitation for kids to discover themselves, to discover their own voice, to welcome them into the world. And so I love working in this space. And I feel really glad that I eventually figured out that this was where I was supposed to be.
You have a real talent for, I guess, kind of breaking down some of those bigger issues for a younger audience. Some very, heavier situations take center stage in your novels. Other Worlds from Home centers around a Syrian girl immigrating to the U.S. A rover story is told partly from the perspective of the Mars rover, and even this book, it focuses on these real world animal friendships. For you, what does the road look like from the initial idea or like coming across a concept maybe to deciding I'm going to make a whole book based on this thing?
Yeah, it's so I've gotten better at that. I think I used to be like so impulsive that even if I had like the zig of an idea, I wanted to start writing. And sometimes you squash an idea, right? Too early. For me, an idea, I have to let it live in my head for a while. So I got really interested in the Mars rovers, but I had no idea like how I could tell a story about a Mars rover. And so I just sort of let myself explore about the Mars rover program. I didn't have any specific direction I was trying to put on the story. And the more I learned about the rover program, the more the story started to crack open in my head. Because what happened was through all of my research, I learned just how dangerous what we ask the rovers to do is. And so my brain went, well, they understand what they're being asked to do. Can they understand how scary it is? And if they do, are they afraid? And then that next question of, but do they feel like they shouldn't be afraid? And that's when I was like, okay, I understand the story. This is a story about difference. This is a story about having big feelings, which are definitely things I had as a kid. And so that was my like emotional entry point. And that's when it became a story as opposed to the concept of I'm writing a book about a rover. And it was similar for Chase and Finnegan, right? I became fascinated by this real life program where they really do bring dogs to be companions with cheetahs. And I thought, what an amazing way to talk about being friends with somebody a little bit different than you, how vulnerable it is to connect with someone a little bit different than you, that you have to really open up and, explain how you see the world and learn how they see the world. But that's not a story, right? I had to figure out who these characters were and what they were asking and feel emotionally connected to them. Just a process of brainstorming. And that kind of happens through when it's a real world topic. Lots of times the story will start to come to me as I'm doing the research, but I take a lot of long walks, listen to a lot of music, and just sort of try to daydream. I used to get in trouble as a kid for daydreaming all the time, and now my job is daydreaming. So I feel a little bit happy about that. Because that's basically what I do, but I have to clamp down on myself and say, no, it's okay to daydream. It's okay to spend a lot of time daydreaming about it before you get started. Because I think sometimes when you get started too soon, like I said, you can squash an idea or it can become really prescriptive because you're putting like an immediate lens on it. Whereas if I let it live in my head longer, it has a chance to become something different.
So, for those who may not know about the background, could you briefly tell us what the unlikely tale of Chase and Finnegan is about?
Yeah, so the unlikely tale of Chase and Finnegan is about a dog named Finnegan and a cheetah cub named Chase. And at the beginning of the book, when we meet Finnegan, he has been kicked out of his home. So he's now a stray dog. He's lost in the woods. As readers, we don't know why he's been kicked out of his home. We just know he feels a lot of shame about it and doesn't want to think about it, doesn't want anybody to know. But then he ends up being found by another human. And at first, he's not sure he can trust this human. He doesn't know what's going on, but he eventually ends up being brought to a very unexpected place. He's brought to the zoo where he meets Chase, who has been struggling herself. She's the only cheetah left in the cheetah program, and she feels so much pressure. She's really feeling anxious about it. She's not sure she's going to be what the zoo wants, right? If she's going to be able to perform, if she's going to be able to be on display for humans. She doesn't know what it means to be on display, what they're looking for. And Finnegan learns that his job is going to be to try to be Chase's friend, but he's not really sure what that means. What does it mean to be a friend? How do you support Chase? But as the story goes on, we start to realize that maybe Finnegan needs Chase as much as Chase needs Finnegan. And it's really a book about what does it mean to be vulnerable? What does it mean to open up to someone? What does it mean to be willing to be honest? And sometimes we have to be honest about the things that make us feel insecure and vulnerable in order to really get the support that we need. And I hope we'll open up conversations about those things, like in classrooms or in homes.
Right out of the gate in the novel, Finnegan's anxiety at his changing environment and new situation, they're put front and center. When you're writing for a younger audience, is it ever challenging to tackle these kinds of bigger topics? And how do you balance emotional depth with keeping the story accessible and engaging for that age group?
Yeah, I think, kids live in the real world. Kids feel a gamut of emotions. I think books are safe places to explore difficult topics. For me, when I was a kid, I was lucky enough that I encountered some of the harder truths about life in a book first before that happened to me in real life. And that actually really helped me, right? That let me know when these really tough things happened that I wasn't the only person in the world who'd ever felt that. It gave me emotional vocabulary that fortified me for that experience. And so I think it's really important that we write books for kids that meet them where they are, that help them to grow emotionally as people who are going to exist in this world that is beautiful. And there's so much to love about it, but there's also moments that are really hard. And I think that it's okay to be honest about that. For me, the art of writing for young people is a balance of that honesty, that truth, but also hope. I think when you write for kids, as Catherine Patterson famously said, you're duty bound to write with hope. And I hope, I'm using that word a lot, but my goal, I guess, for all of my books is that they feel like an invitation to make the world better, right? To go and make a connection with someone else, to share your voice. And so even if it's a really hard topic, I hope that it's inspiring to kids. It makes them feel less alone. And so there's a hopeful component to any type of darkness that's in the book. I think the light is always turned up a little bit more than it is dimmed. And that's an important part, I think, of writing for kids. And it's not about being dishonest. It's not about sugarcoating things. It's just about channeling what I really do believe, which is that young people continue to make the world a better place, and that books help us to become better people, right? Because we learn to respect the emotional interiority of people other than ourselves. And that's a really powerful thing.
I'm curious because this is the setting for this book is based around a real thing that's happening at the Cincinnati Zoo and other zoos around the world. What kind of research did you do to understand these animal relationships and how these programs worked? And were there any details that surprised you?
First, I should tell listeners that when I was in fourth grade, Catherine Hilker, who is the legendary founder of the cheetah program at the zoo, graciously let me interview her as a fourth grader. So in fourth grade, we had to do a biography project. And most of the kids in my class, chose Abraham Lincoln or Queen Elizabeth II, or I guess what you would call like a normal famous historical figure. I chose to do mine on Catherine Hilker, and she let me interview her. And so, not that this project from fourth grade is really what steered the book, but I had some entry point. And so I wrote an email to Cincinnati Zoo being like, I'm a longtime fan. Here's the proof. And they were so gracious. They let me come tour the program. And then I got to ask all those questions that aren't necessarily the questions you would find online, right? You can learn a lot about the program, like online and through books, but sort of the like daily rhythm of like, when do you feed the dogs? When do you feed the cheetahs? Do they eat together? Like, what does nap time look like? Do they ever get mad at each other? All these things. And I think some of the surprising things I learned is I just learned, how much animals communicate through body language, similarly to humans, and how cheetahs and dogs can have big misunderstandings about that, right? Like if a dog gets down on their front paws and wags their tail in the air, that means like, hey, I want to play. I want to be your friend. Those of us with dogs have seen that behavior at a dog park. But for a cheetah, that's an aggressive stance. That means like, I want to fight, back away. We have a problem. And so right away, I was like, this is amazing to be able to talk about how sometimes we just don't understand each other, right? And we have to learn how to communicate that like this facial expression means this to me, but maybe you're interpreting it in a different way. And so that was really cool. I also learned cheetahs make like a really funny sound. I think I thought of them as like a big cat. So I thought it was going to be like a growl or a roar, but it's a chirp. It sounds like a bird, honestly. And so that was so fun to write into the book. And then the last thing, which I didn't really learn from touring the program, but through my research, was about dogs. And I always knew like dogs have amazing noses. I'm a big dog person, so that wasn't a surprise. But just like how powerful a dog's nose was a surprise to me. And I learned that dogs really can like smell our emotions. And so as a writer, this opened up a really cool pathway to think about like, well, what happiness smell like? What does sadness smell like? Like how can I inhabit this perspective of a dog in a really creative way through language? And so that was sort of a delight that surprised me.
When writing in animal characters, how do you decide where to draw the line between realistic animal behavior and giving human-like emotions and thoughts to them?
Oh, that's tricky. I don't think I thought too much about that. I was raised on Charlotte's Web. Like I think we do anthropomorphize animals, right, in human culture. And this was not meant to be a realistic nonfiction book about how animals communicate. It's meant to be an enjoyable story for young readers where they're hopefully going to use the animals as avatars for themselves and their own emotional growth. And so I probably take a hard turn towards the other side of that. And I recognize like some people feel strongly and differently, but to me, it's a work of fiction. And my work, what I'm the most interested in is emotions. And I believe animals have deep emotions. And so I was only able to do the best I could do to convey. I think where I tried to keep the authenticity is in language, right? A cheetah is not going to have all the reference points that my human characters would have. So I might come up with a great metaphor, but a cheetah is not going to have that language. And so that's where I tried to be creative and really inhabit this animal perspective. I really tried to think about a cheetah's physicality. Like, what is it like to have whiskers that are so sensitive? What is it like to move that quickly? What is it like to grip the ground like that? And really get in that perspective. And same with the dog. Like for us, our dominant sense is sight. For a dog, their dominant sense is is smell. And so in Finnegan's chapter is really honoring that. And so I did try to like really make it feel believable that these characters are inhabiting these viewpoints. But of course, there's a stretch just in the way a rover story. There's a stretch. Like, do the drone and the rover really talk to each other like that? We know they talk to each other, but of course, their dialogue probably doesn't look like that. But I'm a novelist, right? And what I want to do is write enjoyable fiction. And so for me, the animal stories that I love, like Charlotte's Web and more recently the one and only Ivan, I think take that leap, and I think they take it in like a delicious and enjoyable way. And so I jumped in 2 feet first to that too.
And nothing wrong with that. I think, the classics are classics for a reason, you know? So you do a lot of school visits, talking directly to the kids you're writing for. For you, why do you think that those kinds of connections are so important for young readers?
Yeah, I mean, for me, first, it's really important for me for kids to see me as a regular person, also as a writer from a minority in the United States background, right? And see anyone can be an author. Because that's something I didn't understand as a kid. I really, really wanted to be an author, but we didn't know anyone who was an author. It didn't seem like a job you could do unless you were like independently wealthy. And so, well, not every kid I meet is going to want to be an author. Probably a lot of them have some kind of big dream. And I want to encourage them that they can do anything they want to do. And everyone who does any of those things starts off as a regular person, right? That I'm just a regular person who lives in suburban Chicago and gets to write books, but also just connecting with kids, right? Letting them know they're not alone. I always talk about how I felt so different as a kid. And then it's so cute. Kids today, they do this sign language sign that means like me too. And I'll see so many kids do that. And this idea, right, that we've all felt different. I talk about how to me, the X factor of writing is vulnerability. I share this Shel Silverstein poem that I love about two characters who both have blue skin and they're hiding it with a mask. And so they miss out on this chance to like connect with one another because neither one is brave enough to show their true self. And I'm always encouraging kids, I'm like, think about what your blue is. Like, how can you share that on the page? Because that's really how you're going to make the connection. And I talk about, when you're young, it's so scary to feel different and you kind of run away from this thing that makes you feel different. But that I want them to understand that maybe to start thinking about how when they get older, that might be their favorite thing about themselves, because that's what gives them something to say. That's what gives them their viewpoint. And I say all these things that I used to be so insecure about when I was a kid, like the fact I wasn't white, the fact that I was super, super sensitive, like that I cried really easily, got mad really easily, the fact that I was super daydreamy and was not a good test taker because of that. Like all these things that used to make me feel really alone and weird as a kid are now the things that I use every day in my job. And so I love getting to visit and see the kids. But I honestly think the school visits are as important for me as they are for the kids, because it reminds me of what it's really like to be that age. I think sometimes as adults, we can get abstracted. And those of us that write for kids, like I love librarians, I love teachers, and they're a huge part of what makes or breaks a book, right? And so there can become this tendency to write a book for librarians. And that's not really what any of us should be doing, right? And so getting to do these school visits reminds me like who my real reader is, like my intended audience is. And I think that's a really valuable thing for me to constantly be reminding myself of.
I've heard you recently talk about your process for writing. Media tends to glamorize the acts of writing. Authors seclude themselves in a log cabin or they're sitting on a beach chair with a laptop. And while these are certainly glamorized exaggerations, writers do tend to have rituals for the act of writing. Do you want to share kind of anything special that you do when you sit down to write?
Yeah, so I'm at my desk where in an ideal situation is where I do most of my writing. My children are off school today because it's St. Patrick's Day here in Chicago, and that is a holiday in Chicago. But this is actually a pretty normal environment where I'm hearing lots of laughing and giggling and chasing the dog, where I'm up here working. But one of the things I do to focus is I'll light candles. And to me, that is just like a muscle memory thing of when the candle is lit, I'm not checking email. I'm not looking up sports news. I'm not doing any of the things that I like to do to distract myself. I'm focused. I talked a little bit about how I think so much of writing is thinking. And so I try to honor that by taking really long walks with my dog. I try to do that daily. So like I'll write in the morning and then I take a walk, and that's where I daydream. So I'll have some momentum to start the next day. And something else I do that I think I've now learned is different is I write what I call like a zero draft. And it's a draft that I basically burn once I'm done with it. So it's an exploratory draft where the characters, they change names, the viewpoint changes. Like it's so messy. Like my first draft is also messy, but it's not this chaotically messy, the thing that gets sent to my editor. It has one, POV, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's my chance to really figure out, okay, well, what interests me in this story? Who are my characters? And give the story all their possibilities. And I think why it works for me is because I know no one's going to read it. I'm willing to take all these chances and be really brave in my willingness to fail. And I think that that's a really important part of my process.
Is there a question that you always wish someone would ask you that they never do?
No, I wish I actually had a good answer to that, but I don't know. I always like to shout out other writers, I guess, but people do ask me that. But if anyone on here is listening and wants a good middle grade book recommendation, my dear friend Tay Keller, her book When Tomorrow Burns came out the same day as Chase and Finnegan, and I love that book. It's more upper middle grade. So for those of you who have like 7th, 8th graders at home, recommend that book. I always love to shout out the work of my dear friend John Shu, who is also my neighbor. He writes really heartfelt picture books like This Is a Story, This Is a School, and has a beautiful novel in verse called Louder Than Hunger. And John and I also have a book coming out together next fall. So, but yeah, I guess that would be the thing that I like to do is shout out and support other writers.
And then lastly, if Chase and Finnegan were to sit down and they were to get their little paws on the book and open it up, how do you think that they would react to reading about themselves?
I hope they would think that I did them well. I think maybe they'd be a little uncomfortable at points because what I talked about, I make them very vulnerable. I share the full contents of their heart. But I hope that in the end, they would feel that they were written with love and care, because I adore both of them and put a big part of my childhood heart into both of these characters. And was sort of healing for me because I think I gave them both narrative questions of things that 10-year-old Jasmine really wondered about the world, and got to work through that through these characters.
Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Where can people go to keep up with you and to find all your works?
Yeah, so my website, jasminewarga.com, and then I'm the most active on Instagram. So if you follow me at Jasmine Warga Books on Instagram, I post about my new books, I post about events I'm doing, and I post lots of pictures of my dogs. So
I can't wait to see all the dog pictures. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You can check out The Unlikely Tale of Chase and Finnegan right now, wherever books are sold. Next week on the Writer's Block podcast, I am sitting down with poet Victoria Lauren to talk about her books Crescendo of Chaos and Promises of Poison.
You don't necessarily need that long to develop your story in poetry, and I love that about it. It can be one line that'll just shake you to your core, or one line that'll change the entire perspective of the story that you're reading, and I really respect that about poetry. It's not always the longest poem. Sometimes it is a couple pages, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a couple stanzas, and you're still getting a full story. You're world building in such small space.
If you're enjoying the Writer's Block podcast, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or your podcasting platform of choice. Follow along with the fun over on social media. We are at Writer's Block Pod on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And if you want to go that extra mile and help us keep the lights on, you can head over to our Patreon. That is patreon.com/WritersBlockPod. where you can get episodes of the show one day early and help support us directly. Once more with feeling, thank you so much to Jasmine Warga for joining us this week on the podcast. Thank you all of you for sticking around for the interview. Hope you had as much fun as I did. Until next time, I've been Greg, you've been awesome, and keep writing. Writer's Black is a Good Nerd Media production, hosted by Gregory Nikas, produced by Grimothy Kaus, produced and edited by Gregory Nikas. Special thanks to Martha Kiley and Jasmine Warga.